Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us for a very, very important topic tonight, which is supporting Asian American and Pacific Islander women. My name is Waverly Dolaman, and I'm a member of the CWD board. I'll start with a few introductory remarks for everyone, and then we will jump into the topic. So in terms of tonight, many of you have been following along with some of our other series. So we'll just share a couple of logistical and technical details to keep in mind during the panel. So for tonight's panel, we'll have approximately 45 minutes of speaking, and then we'll open it up for some questions. If you have questions, we'd like if you could paste them into the Q&A. So you'll see the button below on the screen rather than the chat. And when we get to the Q&A portion of this evening, we will read the questions on your behalf. And one thing to keep in mind is that there may be some questions that we don't get to due to time, or we may find it makes sense to combine questions just to sort of simplify the ask. So that's the important and logistical details for tonight. And I did want to actually take a moment to acknowledge something that's very important to us with CWD, which is that we are on lands in Washington State that are the lands of many Native American tribes. So as CWD and I myself are based in Seattle, we are actually on the land of the Duwamish. If you'd like to learn more about this, we've included a source in the far left corner of the screen for you to read more about what the land acknowledgement is important to us and what it means. We also want to acknowledge just the role that Native women have played in Washington State. We will share more details about our intent to really have a panel and share more about their lives and experiences in the future. But for now, we'd actually like to jump right in to the panel. So I'd like to turn it over to Nina to introduce the wonderful women who have graciously joined us this evening to talk about very important issues.
Hi, thank you, Waverly, and thank you, Connie, Francis, and Center for Women Democracy. And thank you for this space to send our voices and our thoughts and perspectives. Thank you all for being here with an open mind and open heart to learn and grow as you hear from our amazing panelists, Toshiko Hasegawa, Grace Wang, and Councilwoman Kim Kan-van. I want to briefly say that there's a diversity of identities within our Asian American, Southeast, and South Asian, as well as Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities. So as you listen to our perspectives and our voices, I just wanted us all to acknowledge the diversity within our voices, and we're not representing everybody. I also wanted to say that we are still living the experience of racism in real time, as it hasn't been very long since the mass murder of Asian American women in Atlanta, Georgia. So this conversation has very real intersections and real impact to our current day stories. That said, I want to go ahead and turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves. Let's start with Toshiko Hasegawa, and then we'll go with Grace Wang, and then Councilwoman Van. So Toshiko.
Thank you so much, Nina, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Toshiko Hasegawa. I am the Executive Director at Washington State's Commission on Asian Pacific American Affairs. I was appointed to this position by Governor Jay Inslee in October of 2018. And the Commission advises the governor, the legislature, and all other state agencies on issues impacting Asian and Pacific Islander community members. Just to give you a quick snapshot of who we are, Asian and Pacific Islanders come from over 42 countries from around the world. We speak over 100 languages and over 1,000 dialects, and it is a very tall charge to try to serve them. And in our work, we collaborate with 12 appointed commissioners who represent some of the geographic and cultural diversity of the state. I'm very pleased to be here with you all today and look forward to today's discussion.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Grace Wang, and professionally, I am the Director of Policy for the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, which is a national organization focused on policy, technical assistance, training, and research on issues of gender-based violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking. across the diversity of Asian and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander communities across the country and across the 48 lower US states, Hawaii and Alaska, as well as our Pacific territories. And also just some other background, I'm a member of the Washington State Women's Commission, and also am a longtime victim advocate. I formerly worked at the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and before that I was in private practice as an immigration attorney and a legal services lawyer before that. So that's some of my background.
Great, thank you.
Yes, hi everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to be on the panel today. My name is Kim Kan Vang, and I'm a Renton City Council member. I was elected in 2019 as the first Asian American woman onto the council. Renton has a population of 105,000 residents, and of the population in Renton, we are growing as far as NHPI. We have about 27% as of the last census, and very much excited to be here. My journey to elected office was very much myself, born in Vietnam and a refugee at age of 5, and resettled in the United States after going to the refugee camp. And so seeing the need in our community and entering law school, being the first in my family to graduate in university, and then of course, practicing law for the last 10 years. And so I'm excited to be here, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. And as you can already tell, all three of our amazing panelists come with a really wide range of experience and voice. And so let's go ahead and just jump right in, right? So first question for tonight or this evening is, in your experiences with Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities and women, what has been some of the biggest challenges that you see that we're facing with regard to harassment and violence? And anyone can jump in and
Like, I'm happy to start. I mean, this is the work that I do every day. And I think, and I view this, both from a personal level as well as, a big picture policy level. And I'll start with the policy. It's a little bit less personal, but we'll get there. But in any event, in our work, we really view violence along a spectrum, right? And so I feel like so much is lost in terms of people's experience of violence and harassment, et cetera, because we minimize and we dismiss, some of the smaller, less obvious examples of the violence we experience. And so violence is really experienced along a spectrum. And as Asian American women, I think, we go through life experiencing microaggressions, and, all of us probably have stories from our childhood of being called names, all the way up to, obviously, as we go through life, the fetishization of us and the perceptions that Asian women are either submissive and will be, are highly sexual beings, or, fit a dragon lady type image. And so, there's a lot of dehumanization of all of us in those caricatures of us in our communities. But I think, and then that goes along the spectrum to, domestic violence, sexual harassment, sexual assault, homicide or femicide. And, as we recently saw in Atlanta, mass murder. And then if you want to take it on a global level, for those of us that are thinking about it that way, war and colonialization of our countries and our home, where our families are from, in terms of that spectrum of dehumanizing people and really being able to commit those levels of harm against people because we don't see them as full human beings. And so you know, just that's the big picture. And then I'm going to put in the chat just a slide that my colleagues at the Institute have put together just to show some of the examples of how women and girls experience violence over the life cycle. And so, you know, I'm hoping that'll be a resource for people and to take a look at, but I'll stop there. I'm sure that others have opinions on these issues.
Great. Thank you, Grace. I really very much appreciate what you were sharing. Other panelists.
Yeah, I can't disagree with that. I mean, all the stories, all the words that are coming out of your mouth with Grace, it's like these images are coming into my head, right? And really, you know, as a refugee, I mean, there was already violence against women and Asian women, in this case, Vietnamese women, even before I was born, before I was even a concept. And so that led into our history of violence and intergenerational trauma. Myself, being one of my siblings, is a mixed child from the war. And so there we go, we already have this image, right? And then of course, resettling after the refugee camp in the Philippines and here in the United States. But the stories I would hear is that Vietnamese women are sold to Taiwanese men. So the human trafficking, the fetishizing, you know, of our people and of women. But in the United States, my experience, and I'll talk more from a personal experience rather than a general policy level, is that, you know, we go through and not one is the language fluency. I was not fluent until I was in 4th grade. And then certainly that model minority myth stereotype that adds on to it, that you had to be dutiful to your parents, your siblings, and that you can't go outside of that box or that flower. And that really harms us, and that perpetuates and allow the dominant culture and perpetrators to perpetuate, act certain ways to harass and on this continuum of things that Grace had mentioned. And so, yeah.
Yeah, and the thing I would add to that is that there's social issues and there are also structural issues, right? In the way that we're valuing women and the way that we're valuing people of color, and how for every obstacle that, you know, is in the way of somebody getting either the equal treatment or the support that they deserve, it's compounded by these compounding identities. You don't take one off, put the other on, you are all these things at once. And so, you know, at CAPA, we really approach things through like buckets as we try to attack some of these structural issues, right? You're looking at education, you're looking at access to healthcare and human services, you're looking at, you know, civil rights, you know, what are women allowed to do? What are people of color allowed to do? You know, what's the oppression that we experience? And that's part of why it's so important that we work intersectionally with other communities of color and other groups, you know, or other entities representing historically marginalized groups, is because there's always going to be intersectionality in some of these issues. And so, you know, I just wanted to, the question is like, what is the most, you know, what's the biggest challenge facing women of color today? It's like the ongoing and perpetual state of patriarchy right here at home and across the world. And also like not only racism, but like quite specifically white supremacy that is upheld both societally in our attitudes and our actions and our perceptions, and also structurally in the way that we're putting up barriers for people to have equal access and equal treatment under the law.
Absolutely. I completely 100%, just you can see me shaking my head because I'm on track with all of you on your thoughts on this. Let's continue to talk a little bit about intersectionality, right? Toshiko, you just addressed that, and women of color have always addressed that issue, right? The intersectionality of our experiences. So let's take that even further. What role does intersectionality play? So just building on that, in our experiences as Asian American Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander women regarding violence, right? This intersectional experience, and also the way that it's interpreted. And then what gets lost when we don't use the intersectionality lens, right? Which is what we have been seeing with experiences that we've been going through. So anyone?
I just want to shout out Darcy Huffman. I see you in the crowd. Thank you so much for being here today, sister. You know, I want to speak specifically to and use this as an example because I think it's probably what compelled a lot of people to be here today. But that very high profile case where, you know, we saw not only, you know, mass murder of Asian people and this heightened trend of anti-Asian violence, but it was also very much a case of femicide that was targeting Asian women in their Asian-owned business where they work, right? And so there's also an aspect of economic vulnerability here. And we take that within the context of like a political climate that intentionally stoked you know, anti-woman rhetoric, anti-Asian rhetoric, and also pro-white supremacy rhetoric as well. And as you see some of these trends and hate crimes grow, you also have to take it into context. It's not just against Asian folks. This is part of a larger trend that we're observing against Black folks, Jewish folks, and women more broadly here at home and across the nation. And so when we're lending our voice to things like Stop Asian Hate, are those same voices going to lend themselves to things like Black Lives Matter or tearing down the patriarchy and stopping violence against women? And I think it's just pertinent because we all need to see ourselves in this situation in two ways, both as potential victims, right? Because some of those victims, they were not women. Some of those victims, they were not Asian. And that's the pervasive nature of hate, is that it can touch and hurt all of us. Like we are inherently linked that way, but we also need to challenge ourselves to see us as in some way complicit in upholding some of these systems of oppression. And only when we're ready to sit in that discomfort and recognize the changes that we're willing to make as individuals, as organizations, as institutions, are we going to do the work that's necessary to proactively tear them down. And that's part of what being an active anti-racist and be part of being a feminist is all about. And so I would actually argue you can't be one without actually coherently embracing the value of all life and the rights of all people.
Yeah, I think we have to look at it in several ways. One is the individuals and institutions, right? And systems that have been in place. And certainly I have the sign hate is a virus versus Stop Asian Hate. Because hate is a virus, in the sense that a virus, it is able to grow and maintain itself in certain environment. And here we're talking about political environment and systems that are continuing allowing it, right? When we have elected officials not condemning hate, not saying what is your plan to address hate across the spectrum, not necessarily that it's happening to Asian American communities that you need to address it, but what is your plan? It is a duty and a responsibility and honor for electeds to do that. And so when we look at, like, I can't take off my lens of a refugee, of a woman, of a mother, and just being Asian. Like, that's just not how this works. And certainly everyone here on the call, but definitely I find that being a woman has been, it shouldn't be a barrier, but society has made more laws to basically oppress me, an individual like myself, who are in this particular gender or sex, right? So it's like, it's interesting when we compile all these identities, which one really is the most oppressed of me. And I think that's really, when I learned individually, when I had two kids, my first child, I realized it's not just a cultural thing in our family, being Vietnamese, being Asian, but it's also very much a systematic thing. And these are things that I've heard throughout my whole life, as well as other folks, right? And so it's really interesting that when we start talking about breaking down barriers, we have to look at our different identities and that we exist in those as a, it's coexistence. But it's important, as we are talking about uplifting Asian American voices and what has been happening, like I can only share my lived experience and work through my lived experience, but still have these different lens and work in solidarity, right? So I cannot say that even I can empathize with Black Lives Matter. I can empathize with Indigenous rights and no DAPA, you know, all the climate justice. I think it really hits to where I'm more knowledgeable with an area where I have lived experience or professional experience.
Thank you, Ken.
I just wanted to build on, you know, what both Toshiko and Kim kind of said about, you know, the bigger political environment as well as our, you know, personal experience. I am recalling a few years back, you know, when the Me Too movement really started to explode, and some of the things that were happening even in Olympia, right, in terms of like the experiences were being shared. And as somebody who did a lot of work in Olympia, I just really found that like the discourse, it didn't resonate with me because it wasn't my experience about how I had been treated, you know, in the halls of Olympia, but rather my experiences were much more about, you know, I think like I couldn't disentangle, like, was that slight? Was that about race? Was that about gender? Like the way that I was treated, it felt really gross. And at the same time, I couldn't, you know, it's like, it wasn't overtly sexist or misogynistic. It wasn't overtly racist. It was kind of this mishmash thing, right? And so like going through life, and I felt like that very same feeling when the news started coming out around Atlanta, around, you know, like this isn't race, you know, this is not a hate crime because this wasn't a race-based thing. And I was like, my experience of, you know, how women experience racism, it's like it absolutely is a race-based thing in terms of what happened in Atlanta. And so it's just, I think it's important for us, you know, as we move forward to be able to like, you know, figure out how we articulate and share our stories and lift up our experiences of how, you know, we have experienced those micro, macro aggressions across, you know, in our lives, and experienced, you know, that essentially erasure or dismissal or what is another word? Like words aren't coming, you know, there's just not a good word that like articulates how, you know, we weren't really offered, you know, an ability to fully participate. Our humanity wasn't seen, and we've all experienced that in different ways through our lives, right? And so, you know, we just really need to figure out how we are able to share those stories and bring our full selves to the experiences of, you know, American life and being Washingtonians and all of those things. So I guess I'll leave it at that. It's not particularly profound, but I just know that like I finally feel, you know, and I'm not young anymore, but I feel like it's finally to a point in life where like our stories really are starting to be told. So,
you know, the system is not set up to empower women. It's not set up to empower people of color. It's not set up to empower immigrants, just like the criminal justice system is not set up to empower victims, right? So it's what we see is just the tip of the iceberg. And to your point, Grace, the Me Too movement was women showing up and standing in solidarity and really shining a light at just how prevalent, you know, misogyny is. And there's a lot to be said about how much work there is to do to be able to proactively have inroads in for women to be able to be supported and protected, much less receive any sort of justice. So part of what the problem is what we're seeing right now when it comes to hate crimes targeting Asian folks or women or Asian women specifically, is that there's really not a whole lot of data around it. And for the data that there is, you know, it's certainly not disaggregated, and sometimes it's not accurately captured. And the reason why that's important is because like you have to make a case for something if you want to see it resourced, if you want to see some sort of policy action or policy change. And I see somebody has a question of like, how can individuals or organizations you know, support this issue. And the thing is like, we are asking community-based organizations to step in and support women, to support people who are experiencing domestic violence or gender-based violence, who have been victims of human trafficking or economic exploitation, and yet we don't adequately resource folks to be able to do that work. And so it's just this again, compounding challenges for women who are facing compounding, you know, challenges. Yeah, and it's certainly not a simple fix.
Right, it's like a chicken and egg story. Which one comes first and how we address the thing? We can't just have to address everything at one time in some ways, but really identifying the issue, right? Which is first, once you see it, then you have to denounce it. So with like Asian Americans, this whole thing of, you know, the model minority, which is a myth, and then certainly leaving out a lot of our community members, the Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders, Southeast Asian, Khmer. I mean, the experience of the Vietnamese Americans are different from the Khmer Americans, right? Even though we're Southeast Asians. And then there's this thing of Asian Americans as perpetual foreigners. So it's quite interesting how these dynamics come into play and how that affect violence against Asian women and then just in general against women. But I, you know, to answer that question, I'm part of League of Women Voters, Southern County, with the Climate Action Group. And the way I see things is, how do we build equity in climate justice, right? And particularly for BIPOC communities and Asian women, and how where were we residing, right? In the airport communities or in more of the less resource communities. I would say definitely support API Chaya, support Coalition Ending Gender-Based Violence, just kind of naming some of our other organizations out there. But it's definitely some things that we really need to look and hold our elected official accountable.
I see Pam Meeks in the room. She'll tell it to you. You got to see more women in elected office, right? We got to be the ones making the laws who are going to not only serve our interests, but actually prioritize our interests. You know, and it's that reason why representation matters. And we still don't have parity when it comes to decision making. You know, in leadership roles, we still aren't adequately represented in certain workplaces and industries. And even if we have inroads into doing that, we're not retained, right? We need to like be holistically empowered economically, socially, politically, if we ever want to see any sort of meaningful outcomes in the way that we experience this society and this life.
Yeah, and speak truth to it, that, you know, Center for Women and Democracy is the core of your work, as I've known the last few years, is basically supporting women and advancing women in leadership. And it's, you know, continuing those work and having allies supporting it. And of course, putting, you know, resource, right? Put your money where your mouth is, which comes through the government structure, because our budget is our value statement.
You know, I talked to somebody and she said, well, you know, when I think of racism, I don't really think, you know, Asian folks. When I think of like issues and who's impacted, I think women have come a long way. And it's like, yes, but you have to take it in the context of American history, right? Like, for example, in World War II, Asian or Japanese women, all Japanese folks, it was a mass incarceration. And what folks don't know about the internment camps is that there was actually a bill that was introduced in Congress that sought to sterilize all Japanese American women. And that bill only died by one vote. And had that passed, I certainly wouldn't be here today. And as shocking as that is, that's actually been instrumented against Native American women and Black women in this country. And when you hear about things like indefinite detention, unconstitutional detention of women at the border, and child separation, and, you know, unverified hysterectomies, you have to know history can and will repeat itself, which is why we have to stay vigilant as women. There will always be laws coming for us. There will always be somebody, for some reason, who seeks to oppress us, right? That's the way power works. And that somebody told me something that has always stuck with me. And they said, if you want power, you're going to have to take it. And I think that that's a call for all women, to know that we cannot shy away from our own greatness. We are the majority, right? Like, we aren't waiting for permission or for somebody to make space for us. We have to step into these places and claim them as our own. And that's the only way we're going to see some real outcomes in the way this society values us.
I'm just going to add a little sliver of history information to what Toshiko sparked my memory about this. But the very, very first anti-immigration law, immigrant law in the United States, we think about, all of us learn about, well, not all of us, very few of us actually, but some of us do learn about, the Chinese Exclusion Act being one of the, first sets of laws that discriminated against people based on race, essentially. But actually before the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was in 1882, the very first one was targeting women, and it was called the Page Act of 1875, which prohibited bringing in laborers, the language said, from China, Japan, and other Oriental nations for the purposes of lewd or I think lewd or promiscuous purposes. I can't remember exactly what the language was, but in turn, targeting folks, coming to work in the sex industry, against sex workers, perhaps. But what ended up happening because of that law actually passing was that, spouses and, women coming to join their partners in the US were discouraged from immigrating because they didn't actually want to go through this process of, being strip searched, being, going through physical examinations, being asked really obnoxious questions by immigration officials at the time of entry. And so it served, as a tool to limit immigration of Asian women in the United States, both, ostensibly for lewd purposes, but also, effectively limiting immigration of Asian women. And that continues to this very day. Our entire immigration system, which I will say is broken, continues to allow for discriminating against folks from, based on country numbers, and, even folks that have been waiting 20, 30 years to join their family members are impacted. And so all of these issues, intersect. And so that's an area that certainly we need a lot of support in terms of meaningful reform. So I'm going to put that out there too.
Yeah, and I totally agree. You actually took the words out of my mouth as far as the history, but that Page Act really is instrumental in some of our Chinese community members, friends of mine, and of course you guys know folks as well that are, now second generation or first generation, but then they should have been, part of their families have been here since the 1800s. So it's quite interesting that, myself, refugee, it's different in the 1980s after Vietnam War, right? But then when we say history repeats itself, it is true, but as we're in this historical moment, as we are making history, creating modern day history, how are we able to hold it accountable is really important in righting the wrongs, right? Because it's just drastic of what we've seen from policy to policy.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone. And also, if I may add just a little bit as well, and I know probably all of you have heard this from someone in some sort of rhetoric or another, but just the idea of, well, why can't Asian women, or why can't Asian women just get over the issue, right? There's this long history, right, of oppression and systemic oppression that influences all of that to our current day. So the fact that we're all, all of our experiences are intersecting in so many different spots as we're talking about this subject should be something that we all, all are thinking about as well. So thank you for your perspectives. And Toshiko, I feel like I should be around you more often because your perspective is just fire, But I also think about Kimberly Crenshaw, and real quick, I see Dr. Shirley Yee from the Women's Studies program at University of Washington, but just the intersectionality perspective from Black women in our history has so much influence the way that we're fighting for our rights, right, as Asian and Native American and, or excuse me, Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander. So I feel like this conversation is so good, it's just kind of just rolling. So I'm gonna keep going with for the next question. Let's see here. So we're kind of hearing there's a typical response, right, to this larger, very complicated experience of oppression among women, you know, of diverse women as well. In what ways should we change the way we work with our population in order to support one another? And we've kind of addressed this already too, but in what other ways do we best support one another with this?
I mean, I think, you know, I think it's so much of, you know, what we experience in terms of, I've said it before, I feel like at least, you know, some of our older generations, you know, or even, you know, it's being passed along as well. It's like, there's this notion of like, this is how it is. This is how it's always been. And, you know, it's just part of life that we have to experience, you know, some of this harm, some of this hardship in order to, you know, in order to succeed or to get through. And I feel like we have a lot to tackle within our own communities around, you know, the normalization of this is how it is, you know, especially the violence that women and girls experience as they're going through their life. And on that, and I do think we need to figure out how we get, you know, to the other women in our own communities and you know, devise those solutions and those norms and create new norms that like, and that we're not waiting to get permission or okay from the men in our communities and or in the larger, I mean, in the larger community as to what we need. And so, I mean, I'll start with that, and you know, I can think of more specific examples, but I'm excited to hear what Toshiko has to say about
I mean, we are not alone, right? We have seen such mass mobilization. We have seen women's groups emerge to get folks into elective office to be able to provide relief for each other. We've seen like community spaces stood up so that we can literally just hold that safe and brave space with one another for the chaos that has been the Trump administration. You know, we have to mobilize. We got to keep on mobilizing. The Women's March was a wonderful example of giving the people something that they can't ignore. We've got Kamala Harris. Finally, we've got some women in the audience right now who are just like, yeah. And like, how much does that mean to us that she's also one of our own as an Asian woman, and that we have so much work to do, that it's 2021, finally holding that mantle, and she's still not the president. Like, what more? We always have more work to do, and we have to mobilize to do it. And we have to have a big tent, and it's gonna be a big tent if it's women. It's gonna be a big tent if it's intersectional, but we also have to show up not just like, not just on behalf of one another. We have to show up like with each other, right? We have to center the voices of the people who are most impacted, because we're only going to go as far, we're only going to break ceilings as high as the lowest among us. And so we really have to, that's part of what the equity work is as well, right? And I think that's the education work that we have to do within our own communities as Asian people and as women and as women of color, right? And that is the heart work. I mean, gosh, it's exhausting. And I'd also like to say that when crisis hit, it's the people who are impacted who are immediately called to action and who are immediately asked to respond, and it is simply exhausting. And you know, so I think that that's why that sense of solidarity and sisterhood, I can't tell you how grateful I am for sisterhood through all of this. But I love my husband, I really do, but my sisters, you know. So so I mean, we're here for it. It's a movement, but we just have to step up, and we just have to persist.
That's right, persist. Yes. I think there's, you know, as far as our, for me, I look at it more of the intergenerational, right, within our own community as well, as we do build this big tent for broader BIPOC and non-BIPOC allies of women. But in general, given born in Vietnam and just kind of how I was raised and kind of seeing the wisdom of our elders and that process that I've gone through, I really value that perspective, right? Although it could be old school, and I'm old school sometimes because of that. But I think education is important, and educating them of a different perspective, right? It's a lens that they don't have, right? Because they're used to just working 2-3 jobs and learning ESL, learning the language and trying to be naturalized. Or if they have already, you know, they're born here, but they're seniors now, they've, you know, went through the civil rights movement, Vincent Chin murder in the 1980s, and all that sort as well. So it's these struggles that they've had, that we have the struggles now, that I think that there is shared values within the generations. So bridging that generation and then building the bigger tent and really making sure that women's at the front and when it comes to leadership, because, you know, when women thrive, I think, you know, everybody does, right? Our mothers are so resilient. And so it's really learning from those elders and learning from women who've fought the fight. And it's just really what will get us through, but definitely continuing, because exhausting as it is, if we give way, we give up. I mean, if our elders have given up, if women before us have given up, I think I wouldn't be here. And so it's definitely just continuing what we can, and then bringing young folks along and bridging that.
I think that's so right. And I do want to just echo women's leadership and getting folks in positions of decision making, because, you know, I do advocacy on a regular basis, and I'm working in Congress right now. We've been trying to get, you know, resources for culturally specific organizations, you know, targeting, increasing access to language access, interpreters for the diversity of our community, which is such a challenge. Oh my gosh, it's such a challenge. And the burden on our communities, and providing just basic, you know, in this pandemic, just basic access to, you know, information about the disease itself, about vaccinations, about like what, you know, just all the information that's been coming out around COVID. Like there, you know, there's just few resources for that. And so bringing this back to just the advocacy that we are having to do when we're talking to policymakers that have no comprehension of what it means to be, you know, the experiences that women and moms and you know, single mothers in particular, and folks raising children and grandmas, all of the, you know, like they have no comprehension of that to begin with. And then layered on top on top of that is our experiences of, you know, being immigrants and maybe not having immigration status or not speaking the language well and having to navigate all that. And so like going back to just that importance of having decision makers that understand the life experiences that we're facing to be able to address the problems that, you know, we have in our communities is so important.
And when we're talking about activation for civic engagement, I think that it matters who you have in leadership, because the way that you engage people based on culture is unique to the way you would engage and activate people based on gender. So I say that because I think generally speaking, communities of color are less likely to identify with a specific party or political platform. But if you speak to them on the issues, you're going to have a better chance at reaching them. Because, and it's just like the nature of, you know, how much time they've had to be able to, you know, to integrate and affiliate. And so that's why it matters that you're reaching folks. If you're talking about, like, for example, Asian women and how you want to engage them, it has to be culturally specific. It has to be culturally accessible, right? And you have to work with, in conjunction with trusted messengers and leaders like this. That's why some of these folks who are very well intentioned are having a hard time, for example, getting out the vote, are coming into challenges, is because it's not a culturally specific or maybe not relevant approach.
Okay, I just want to make sure that there's no one else who wanted to add that. Absolutely. Go ahead, Toshiko.
Did we want to answer some of these questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so one quick question before we go to the panelists, or excuse me, the audience question. All three of you exercise your voice in such in such a way that's it takes all of these issues and complicated issues, right? And it makes it I can understand, like I can follow, I can get with what you're saying. A question about that is, how did you find your voice? How did you get to exercising your voice on these types of issues in your individual roles? And then we'll jump right into the audience questions.
Okay, I guess I'll take this since I haven't gone first at all. How I exercise my voice, it actually did not come organically. It didn't come like because I had this innate ability. It's really through the experience of being a refugee, right? Experience of being in that camp, waiting in line for 2.5 pounds of rice per week with my family, the experience of going to food banks all the way up to high school, right? And living in housing projects. But really the experience that's hit home the most is being a daughter of a domestic violence survivor, right? And so with that, I see the resilience in my mother, although we differ in opinions a lot of times, but having that community, small community, family communities, a network, and really at the point when I was in 11th grade, having the opportunity to meet the Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was instrumental with Nelson Mandela and the apartheid system, right? And so it's that became, I learned a lot through that process, and really seeing why people's relationship with law is so different, right? My relationship obviously is, I'm not going to trust the law. I'm not going to trust the government. They came and took our land, and then we were in the refugee camp. So that experience alone, and then I see that with folks in our community, our South King County communities, and their experience with the law. And so that really gave me the opportunity to continue to do the work that my mom had in some way indirectly instilled in me, but yet she thinks I'm loud, even though I'm kind of quiet here. But I think generally that really kind of led me into the path to making law accessible and government working for people.
Thank you, Kim.
I'm just laughing because I've seen Kim Van with a megaphone, so I don't think of her as quiet. But you know, and this might sound ridiculous, but high school was an incredibly formative time for me, where I was one of the only mixed race Asian girls in a predominantly white and Black school. And in retrospect, now that I have an objective and sort of empirical understanding of the way society treats Asian women, they exoticize them, the way Asian students experience bullying in high school, it makes sense to me that that experience was as profound as it was. And it's also says I completely lost my voice. I completely lost my power. It manifested in many ways. Once I think I did the healing that I needed to do in the way that I needed to do it, I doubled down and told myself I would never lose my voice again. And when I followed my calling to be able to enter into public service as like a part-time temporary staffer in the Senate, right? And you're starting to experience all those things like imposter syndrome, then I get reverted back to like this reptilian state, and I'm like, and I made the decision to actually and it's something so small, but for me it was important, as I decided to actually proudly show my tattoos. I decided to go around sleeveless, and then I decided to get more tattoos, right? As I continued to climb the ladder. And I think for me, that's what it is to claim space, because what we're there for is to bring our perspective, is to contribute something new and something important, right? And knowing that what you have to say is unique, and in that way it is powerful. And that's what I see my role is as a public servant, who's now not only the youngest director in Kappa history, but effectively one of the youngest women of color ever to serve in a cabinet level position. In that role is to be able to empower the voices of other people, and sort of remove myself away from speaking on behalf of folks, but handing them the mic so that they have the ability to be able to advocate on behalf of themselves. And I think that's how I like to approach leadership in public service.
So I, again, like Kim Khan, I think, so much of where I found my voice was, based on the experience of my parents and their immigrant experience in the United States. And I will say my parents are from Taiwan, and my mother, experienced as a child her family facing government oppression, I guess. And so she lost a family member very young because of political opinion. And that I think had this profound impact on how we grew up in the United States, of my father and my mother actually having very different experiences, of my father getting to the United States and being shocked at how much he felt like he had been lied to by the government in Taiwan. And then my mother being like, just keep your head down. We don't want we don't want anything to do with the government because, of the trauma that she had experienced. And then they had a very rebellious child who just did not want to be told, like, this is how you are. And I think it's just an extension of the personality of just being told, you can't do this. And I've always, I think probably even before I was a toddler, I was like, I'm going to do it anyway. And that's been my personality or mantra ever since, I became a lawyer, to figure out whatever path, like, okay, you can't get status that way, we'll figure out another path, or we'll, and same thing with legislation. It's like, okay, you're not going to get this bill passed this way, we're going to figure out another route. And so it's just, I think it's like this problem solver piece. And then this other part of my personality is just like, I can't be told no. And if I am told no, I'll figure out another way. So there you go.
That's awesome. I absolutely love that. I do. Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing your journey of your voice too. So let's go ahead and jump into some of our audience questions. We've got some really good ones. And I think as we answer one, I think we might be addressing the other one, but we'll see how it goes. So the first question that we got from our audience, can you speak to the mental health services equity and any cultural norms that may be barriers to accessing the mental health services for APO women?
Some languages, like I mentioned, this is complex because there is such a huge diversity in ethnicities and in cultures and languages. Some languages don't even have a word for mental illness.
Mhm.
Some languages you just literally can't talk about it. If there's a challenge, you know, it's a shame upon the family. It's not something that you proactively seek any sort of community support on. You hold it to your chest. And then for folks who do have, I think, sort of like a, I don't know, how would you describe, like maybe a scientific relationship with issues of mental health, and that it's medical and it needs, you know, it deserves help and treatment. Then there's the issue of navigating a system in order to, and even if you could navigate the system or speak the language, you know, could you afford it? Do you have access to healthcare? There are just so many challenges, and it begins with again, cultural and then structural.
Yeah, very, very much to that. I think that really, as you look at our communities, it's so diverse, and you know, we don't have a word for certain illnesses, or it's not in part of the vocabulary. And for example, this is not relating to mental health in some ways, but we had a deaf student, a Vietnamese student who's culturally deaf. And so really we think of deaf folks, generally we hear stereotyping, growing up, we thought of deaf folks as just mute and dumb, right? Which is really very primitive way of thinking, but this is how folks treated folks who were deaf culturally in Vietnam. And so that culture kind of continued, which built its system within this ethnic culture, right? But certainly what we learned, and when I took ASL and really learning that, is that it's learning differences, is how we are, you know, just as if we're hearing, we can still learn differently. And so it's that whole taboo subject when it comes to mental health, as if there's something wrong, that cognitive issue. And so how I've been trying to approach it is really just saying that it's an injured, just if it's an injury, just as if your arm's just, you know, injured, you had a broken arm, you're gonna go to the ER. So if you are stressed or mentally, you have depression, anxiety, because you have depression because someone just passed in your family, really relating it to people and trying to break that taboo, right? Trying to break this, that there's a stigma surrounding it. I've gone through counseling for a temporary period of time because we had a death in a family. I mean, it's really something as human we have to learn to grieve, and grieve without guilt. And oftentimes it is the culture and the systems and laws in place, because it goes back to not having resources, right? And then coupled with when there is resource, how do you navigate that system? And so it's important for us to educate ourselves, and it's okay that to get counseling and treat it as an injury.
Thank you, Kim.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to, I mean, I do have a lot to add, but I actually want to, we'll go on to the next topic, because I think other than you know, figuring out whether or not our systems are actually culturally relevant in terms of you know, appealing to the various things that motivate us in our unique communities. That's also a huge challenge in this country's mental health system. So.
Absolutely. The next question I think is connected. Someone asked, can you speak to the socioeconomic issues that intersect with API racism? Do we see more violence and discrimination to lower income people, or is it pervasive across all levels?
I think it shows up differently, but I think it's pervasive across all levels, and it shows up, you know, on a personal level and on a structural level in different ways. But certainly, you know, across socioeconomic barriers, or you know, different class structures, I think that it does. You know, it intersects with some of the other challenges that other communities of color face as it relates to, you know, people not being afforded opportunities to be able to participate fully in you know, access to resources and economic opportunity. And, you know, we have seen that, like, you know, as it relates to access to housing and, what is the word, disallowing sales and discrimination based on race to be able to build economic equity and power in the history of our country. And there's, so there's that. There's, different structural barriers for folks who are don't have as many access to resources, certainly in our immigration system. I mean, like despite the need that we have for essential workers and in working in what are, called quote unquote unskilled jobs, there's a huge, need for, and, our structure is perfectly willing to exploit AAPI workers, especially in care situations and other economic circumstances where people don't have access to high-paying jobs, and there are also not opportunities for those people to regularize their immigration status and be able to access opportunities to move up. And so, I mean, just on there's personal, and then there's the structural ones. So I'll pass on to my colleagues here because I know they've got insights as well.
Well, just that hate crimes are a legally specific thing, but and I don't know how that data pans out in terms of socioeconomic status and vulnerability, but there is a lot to be said about the vulnerability of Asian women who are not economically empowered. And I think that economic empowerment would go a long way to keeping folks out of exploitative situations. And I think that there's a huge and much larger conversation happening on Monday about human trafficking. And labor trafficking, which is the largest and fastest growing underground market, and how sexual abuse is oftentimes a factor there, but that the primary aspect of their exploitation, their subjugation, is actually their economic disempowerment.
Do you have another question? I
Yes.
can answer, but I'll just echo my colleagues.
Yeah, absolutely. So the last question I have here, is the U.S. Senate passed the anti-hate bill by a vote of 94-1. One is interesting to me. So the person says, I know it's only one step. I wonder if you could each share, are you celebrating? Do you think this bill will help?
Like I said, I think it's important to resource causes that we care about. Put your money where your mouth is, right? I'm also pleased that we saw the city of Seattle decide to do something similar. Yeah, King County decided to do something similar. We're glad to see folks take a political stance in calling, hate or racism like a public health crisis, as it very much is. And things like that are important because they justify, programming and resources. So it's always a start. And, it's always going to be an issue. It's a matter of how far can we take it. So we're glad to get the help.
Yeah.
I'll say from the perspective of, a national organization working on these issues, there are pieces of the bill that we are celebrating, just as Toshiko mentioned, in terms of investment and gathering data and disaggregating information from our communities. And, I just want to flag, it's an issue that we're struggling with in our communities, and there's not consensus about whether or not, investing in what's a criminal legal response to this issue being the most important one. And so I'll just say, there's not consensus even within the AAPI community or the Asian community, Asian American community, and certainly not among those working on gender violence issues. So.
Yeah, I mean, we're so diverse of a community, right? So it's not, if there was a survey to be done, I think it'd be great to see it specifically. But you're in King County. I'm a volunteer with King County Office of Equity Coalition Against Hate and Bias, and the documentation, the stories that we hear in our communities. But really, the API Against Hate movement that was started in early March was really to bring awareness to what's happening to our elderly Asian residents and also community, but really to hold elected officials and leaders accountable to co-create community-based solutions that really centers around community, right? Rather than just making knee-jerk reaction. So any progress is progress. I think we're moving the needle, but certainly the budget is our value statement. So the more you put into human services, the more you put into community-based solution, it really shows that you're caring for the community versus here is the way that folks want elected wants to see it done. So
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Toshiko, Kim, and Grace. Your perspectives and your thoughts have been incredible, and I'm pretty positive that a lot of our audience has learned quite a bit today. So I want to be respectful of our time this evening. So again, just thank you to our panelists, and I'm going to send it over back to our Center for Women and Democracy.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much. Toshiko needs to jump out in a few minutes. So I just want to thank you all for being here. And I'm greatly inspired. I'm sitting there almost shaking because I just love how you were able to connect the dots between so many different topics and to really set out what is at stake here. And I think I'm going to start quoting your statements. Your budget is your value statement. I'm going to keep repeating that over and over again. So thank you for doing so. What I want to do as a quick thank you wrap up here is to announce our next event, which is going to be on May 20th. Sorry, I'm not able to talk and speak at the same time and pulling up the date. But it's going to be at May 20th at 5 p.m. And it's going to focus on the missing and murdered Indigenous women here in Washington State. It will be moderated by Kara Briggs. I can announce that Emily Washines of the Yakama Nation has confirmed the participation. The second panelist has not confirmed, so I will not name at this time. But be on the lookout for the announcement. It should come out next Monday or Tuesday. And I think it's going to be a very important conversation, especially because it touches on human trafficking and some of the issues that you have brought into this discussion. So we can see some of those connections here. Also, I want to tell you to be on the lookout for a post-event survey that we will be sending out tomorrow morning. For the attendees, we would like to hear more about your thoughts about the event, what we can do to continue to amplify the voices of women leaders within specific communities, and to provide, to use our platform in order to amplify voices that may not otherwise go unheard in a lot of these discussions. And so we'll hear more from us on that. And with that, I thank you all for attending. I know it's a beautiful evening. You have other things that you could be doing. And so I thank you for your participation. I also wanted to thank the panelists here for what they have done here. Some of them had to leave there. So thank you.